I'm Jenny. I'm going to get this kicked off more to set Allison up for the really great research study she's going to share with you that she has led. So Allie, you can go to the next slide. Okay. So just a roadmap, I'll just do an overview of extreme heat and school children and what kind of we focused on in Arizona from about 6 or 7 years ago to today, very brief. And then Allison will get into the heat and physical activity and emotional states of children from a research study that was performed last summer. And then at the end, I'll talk a little bit about our Heat Ready Schools program. Next. So just as a motivation, playgrounds and schoolyards, we know they're hot and that they're getting hotter. That's a problem. And it's not just about the playgrounds and schoolyards, but also about what that means for kids when they go inside and what kind of strategies are being used to support their learning and behavior and overall well-being, like Anne mentioned. We also know children are vulnerable to the heat and sun, and that's pretty bad in Phoenix and the region. And so we also often will focus on UV exposure of kids in playgrounds that coincides directly with overall sun exposure and mean temperature, which is a leading driver of heat stress in the valley. And we also know that a lot of the designs, outdoor spaces, or then the designs of some of our heat ready initiatives indoors might lack heat safety within them. So how can we be promoting heat safety throughout what we do in the heat season, especially with rising temperatures, living in hot urban areas, as well as changing school schedules that Allison will mention. You can click 2 more times, Allie. Yeah, so decrease safe play. So just a bit of a little bit of a deeper dive there. Some of the work we've done is looking at kids and their behavioral factors that can increase their vulnerability to heat. We know there's different factors around sweat rates or their body size, so the surface area to body mass ratio, that can make them more vulnerable to heat. We also know that kids are psychologically a little bit more vulnerable. They don't have the experience that adults have to know what to do. And it's an indoor and outdoor concern. This graph is from a study from 2019 that Sally and Iverson led, and just kind of showing the amount of heat-related emergency department visits across Arizona for a 10-year period for students who would be in elementary and high school. Next slide. And so as part of the study that Sally Ann led, this was in 2018 that she completed this survey of 95 schools. And she had so many really interesting findings around what schools are doing, what they're implementing, what they know, that really drove some of the work we do today. So I like to show some of these graphs, and just knowing that they had respondents from cooler climates in Arizona and moderate climates in Arizona and hot climates, and that yes, heat's a problem in hot climates, but actually a lot of the respondents, the schools that responded from hot climates, almost 40% said they didn't think, or they weren't sure if it was a problem for their school in a hot climate. Next slide. And we know that smaller school districts are significantly less likely to have shaded play spaces in any of their schools. And so this is important to understand too, in terms of resource allocation and where we can have more support to understanding the impacts of sun and heat on the children. Next slide. And then overall, we looked into, or Sally Ann looked into, informal and formal heat policies. And this is kind of a driving factor too in some of our work now, trying to understand which schools actually have a formal heat policy in place that they know exactly what to do when it's very hot out or hot out to support their students and staff. And only 26% had a formal heat policy in place. Next. And then finally, we know that the schools and parents were often calling ADHS to ask for resources and what they should do. And some of the schools weren't aware of things like the school heat alert system. So this was from a survey done in 2021 by a past student, Adora Shortridge. And we've been able to then share with a lot of our heat ready schools that I'll talk about later, how they can be on the school heat alert system that ADHS supports. Next. And then finally, just this managing heat extremes or extreme heat recommendations, a pilot version that was created by Matt Roach and Carmen Teardra by ADHS. And that work, we kind of had a really nice time going back and forth between Heat Ready and this really nice pilot document they created. And it leads us to understand what kind of controls we have, and then how can we work with the heat and also ensure that children are still receiving adequate learning and physical activity. So with that, I think that's my last slide, to pass it over to Allie to talk about the study.
All right, great. Thanks, Jenni. So with all of that great information, it sort of prefaced a lot of what drove us to conduct this study, but essentially, really, there were two sort of main outcomes that we were interested in learning more about, both physical activity and emotional states. And that's because both of these things are just very critical for our children's healthy growth and development. And we know that while at school, outdoor play is a major source of both. So school recess in particular contributes half of all school-based physical activity expenditure accrual for children. And we also know that it's directly linked to positive emotions, which is a driver of academic success and classroom performance. So we also know that weather affects physical activity. So in temperate conditions, physical activity is higher, and in poor conditions like extreme heat, physical activity is decreased. And so with this in mind, and knowing the challenges that schools have with offering outdoor play, we were really interested in learning more about how physical activity and emotional states might differ depending on where recess is held. And so a little bit more of context and background. So we've done some additional other work beyond what Jenni introduced and found. In Phoenix, we surveyed staff at 61 elementary schools recently. This was just in the fall of 2023, and found that up to 7 weeks of outdoor play at recess time were disrupted because of the heat. And we also found, similarly to what Jenni was talking about, that a lot of the decisions varied widely, even within the same school district. So we found that of these 61 schools, 39% of the decisions were made at the school level. But beyond that, we found variability within school districts. Just for an example, within one school district, we had some schools reporting no days of recess disrupted in the same time period, where we had another school reporting more than 3 weeks of recess disrupted. So we see that there's not consistent decision-making or uniform guidance, even within the same school districts. Another contributing factor to which drove us to try to better understand this is that we don't have good indoor facilities, and these differ throughout the United States, but particular here in the West, we less than half of elementary schools have gymnasiums. And this number is probably inflated because this also includes California and the Northwest, and schools and those regions are more likely to have indoor facilities. So here in Arizona and in the Southwest, it's probably even lower. But even if we do have gymnasiums in elementary schools, oftentimes they're not available for recess because they're being used for physical education classes, they're being used for lunch. And so there really aren't indoor spaces that can accommodate large groups of students for play. Another factor is that we know a lot of the outdoor environments are not designed to support play and movement in the heat. We have common playground surface types that can be dangerous, tree canopies inadequate, and when there are trees and shade on outdoor campuses, often they're not strategically placed in the areas where kids are moving the most. And so all of these things sort of are compounded by also this shift across the United States, where many schools and districts have started their school years earlier. And this has really interested us, and we actually just wrote an opinion, a commentary piece on this, not published yet, but submitted. So hopefully we'll get to share that soon. But it's intrigued us because we found that a lot of school districts and schools are starting their school years earlier for a variety of reasons, like getting more academic time due to just preferences of staff, maybe parents. There are some policies that support increased number of days in the calendar year. We've also found that the majority of schools that have earlier start dates actually are charter schools because they have more flexibility with their scheduling. But what we haven't really found discussed is the impact of these earlier start dates on students and school staff's exposure to summertime heat. And so we've seen some of this in the media, and we actually have an investigation, a study going on now where we're looking at some of the responses to posts such as these news articles that we posted here. We're really interested in the sentiment of people who are reading and posting, as to, you know, whether this is a problem or whether this is sort of just business as usual. So looking forward to you know, finishing that up and identifying some major themes and sentiments. But overall, really, this prompted, all of these things have prompted this study. So we had three main objectives. The first was to compare children's physical activity expenditures, so how intensely they were playing during recess, and their emotional states when recess was indoors versus outdoors. And these are during periods of high heat. We also wanted to look to see how we could improve integrating environmental and exposure data collection with behavioral data collection. And then finally, we conducted interviews with our school partners, staff, to learn more about the specific things they were doing, how well they, the resources that were needed to do the things that they were doing to accommodate play during extreme heat, and also the things that they wanted to do but didn't lacked the resources and the funds to do them. Okay, so here's just a brief overview of what we did. So this was a cross-sectional study. So we didn't intervene across these 6 weeks that we collected data. And this started in July of last year. So when schools were first starting up in 2024 through September. So across these 6 weeks, just naturally what happened was that sometimes recess was indoors, sometimes it was outdoors. And these decisions were just made by the schools. We didn't dictate when that happened. So we worked with 5 partner elementary schools. We had 2 traditional public schools, 2 public charter schools, 1 private school, and they varied, their locations varied throughout the region. We had one in Ahwatukee, Southern Phoenix, Central Phoenix, Mesa, and Chandler. And what we did was we worked with 5th grade students at these schools, and school administrators and staff, and we collected various different types of data. So we objectively measured physical activity intensity levels while children were playing during recess, and we did this whether recess was outside or inside, and we did this across 1 week at each school. And we also assess the thermal conditions in these outdoor schoolyards at these schools where the kids were playing. And we did these really fine-tuned assessments. So we got some really nice detailed data about what it felt like in these various regions of the playgrounds. We also had students twice a week completing these very short surveys immediately after recess to let us know about their positive or negative emotional states, again, as a predictor of learning in the classroom. And then we also conducted interviews with school staff. All right, so our first objective was to compare children's physical activity intensities or their movement. So what we did, how we did this, is at each school, and you can see this little map here that we have, we took a Google image and we separated the play area into the major areas where kids typically played. And these were either dictated by just natural sort of boundaries, like for example, you can see a basketball court. So typically kids would be playing one type of activity, doing one type of thing in this area. So this was like a zone that we calculated and assessed physical activity within. But we also purposefully divided the playground into spaces that were mostly shaded or not. And we use this validated instrument, which captures group level physical activity. So on average, across a week for any given school in any given area, we could calculate for boys and girls how much time they were spending being vigorously active or just lightly active or sedentary, and where they spent the proportion of time, like most of their time during recess. And we also, Jenni and I and others on the team, extended this tool to also be able to objectively assess where kids, whether they were interacting with nature when they were outside in play and how much time they were spending in the shade versus in the sun. So here's what we found for this first objective here. When we compared children's physical activity and specifically their moderate to vigorous physical activity, so their most intense movement, we found that kids were 40% more active when they had recess in the gym, and 17% more vigorously active when they had recess outside compared to when they were inside classrooms. And this equates to about 15 more minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity when kids are in gyms, compared to 9 outside and 3 in classrooms. And what we see during moderate conditions, typically during recess among elementary age kids, 9 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity is sort of the average. So it's interesting that even during these times of high heat, when kids were outside, they were still getting about the equivalent of what we would normally see in terms of vigorous physical activity. And not surprisingly, when children were inside the classroom for recess, they spent the vast majority of the time sitting, and often on screens. So our second objective of the first aim of this project was to compare children's emotional states, so positive and negative affect when recess was inside versus outside. And we did this with a short survey. You can see these emotions, these little smiley faces that we use. So the kids immediately following recess would take this quick survey twice a week across 6 weeks. The majority of the time, 77% of the time, recess was outside. And when it was inside, most of that time was inside classrooms. Sometimes 7% of the time they were inside gyms. And so what we found here is that children's positive emotional state was statistically significant and higher when recess was either inside the gym or outside compared to inside classrooms. And we can translate that to mean that kids were more ready to learn and emotionally stable when they were able to move more compared to being inside classrooms. So our second aim here was to look to see how we could better integrate our behavioral measurements or our physical activity, our play and our movement with the environmental type of information that we were gathering. And so I've talked already about the physical activity data collection, but we also gathered information about mean radiant temperature or MRT values across all of the areas where we collected our behavioral data. So within each area that we subdivided within all of these playgrounds, we gathered data about the exchange of heat in the surrounding environment. So we had measurements within each of these zones, and anytime there was a difference in surface type, so if within any area that we conducted our observations and gathered data, there was grass versus concrete, we took various different measurements to make sure that we captured any kind of possible interaction between surface types, shade and sun exposure, to capture kind of the full experience of what it felt like to be in this any given place in a playground. And this is important because while air temperatures can vary within just parks or playgrounds or schoolyards, we generally see that this is a very small variation. However, using MRT actually shows what a huge variation these experiences or these thermal conditions actually are. So we're really interested to be able to have that kind of level of detail and better understand how that's impacting behavior. So what we did to try to better integrate these things is that we took these very precise measurements within each of these schoolyard zones, while we also simultaneously collected information about children's play and movement. And then within each of these areas, we weighted the MRT value. So we calculated the percent of shade within each area that we collected behavioral data in. And we took this weighted MRT value and used that so that we accounted for the proportion of any given area that was in sun versus shade as we were comparing and looking to see where kids were playing and how intensely they were moving. And with these two types of data collection, we were also able to take into consideration the various other factors that affect how kids play, like whether there's equipment available, and what type of play structures exist in any given space. So what we found when we looked at levels of movement, so here on these graphs, the top 3 in the top left-hand corner are the proportion of time that kids are spending recess being sedentary, the proportion of time kids are just lightly active, and the proportion of time kids are vigorously active. On the bottom right-hand side, we have just the percent of time that kids are engaged in play in any given area, and we have the most commonly common types of areas that we see in playgrounds. But thinking about movement, the blue and yellow graphs. So blue is in shade and yellow represents the sun. And on the bottom x-axis, we see our MRT values, so like kind of equivalent to temperature. So we can see that kids in general at recess during these hot times, they're always more sedentary in the shade. And as the MRT values or temperature gets hotter, they get more sedentary. And what's interesting is that kids are always more active in the sun. And what it appears to show based on these data is even when it gets to be hot and maybe uncomfortably hot, kids' movement still, vigorous movement is still increasing. And so this is really interesting when we think about the fact that most of these areas where we're seeing the most physical activity, they're generally in open fields and full sun conditions that don't have any shade or tree canopy. And so our last objective here and what we did was we conducted interviews with the staff among our school partners, and we just pulled out a couple of main quotes that we think really summarize what the main messages are. Our school partners think heat's a problem for sure. They don't have enough shade in outdoor settings. They recognize the value of kids engaging in outdoor play. These quotes are from one principal at one of our partner schools that made a dedicated, incredible effort over 2 years to focus all fundraising just on raising money for shade structures. So over 2 years, dedicating all of their fundraising efforts, they raised an incredible amount of money, $80,000, but that's what it costs to add a shade structure over their playground and to get some water bottle refill stations. So while this is incredible, the question about how feasible or realistic this is for schools to tackle on their own is certainly one worth discussing. Okay, our conclusions here that this, in summary, when recess is inside, kids are mostly sitting. If we had gymnasiums or indoor spaces that could accommodate movement, we found that kids would get 5 times more vigorous physical activity and health-enhancing physical activity compared to being inside classrooms. We found that kids are more ready to learn when they're either in gyms or outside during recess. We found that kids are the most active when outside in sunny spaces despite the heat, and then outdoor spaces where kids are most active don't have sufficient shade. All right, I'm gonna turn it back over to Jenni here to talk about some solutions.
Yeah, thanks, Allie. So that project that Allie just shared was really influenced by the creation of our Heat Ready Schools program in 2021. And we're continuing on with the program and still have a lot of active schools where we're really focused on ways that we can increasingly help schools identify, prepare for, mitigate, track, and respond to the negative impacts of school ground heat, both indoors and outdoors. And it's really community-based and focused on policy, the outdoor physical landscape, training and education with students and teachers and staff, the community, and then prevention of heat-related illness and the other adverse impacts of heat. So there's a QR code here, and we'll put the link in the chat if you wanted to check out the website and see what tools and resources there are as part of this little toolkit that we created and we updated it this summer in collaboration with ADHS. And then also Mary Munez and Sinez, and with some help from undergraduate students, created a tree education toolkit for use at schools. Next slide. And so it just kind of has these different recommendations, but what we're looking towards now, and it's part of a new grant that we got from NSF on cultivating school heat readiness in the Southwest, is to figure out ways to integrate safe physical activity into the Heat Ready Schools program through whether it's better outdoor designs, decision support for when to play where, change of location outdoors, changing recess time, more indoor physical activity options, which are part of our toolkit that Allie's group helped us create. So all of that's a big new portion of Heat Ready Schools, and then we're looking to create a scaling method as part of this new grant to be able to scale it to LA and then across the Southwest, hopefully in the long term. And this whole Heat Ready Schools project was born out of a lot of different ideas and people over the years, with people like Melissa Gordaro and funding from Knowledge Exchange for Resilience, Healthy Urban Environments, and so forth. So it's really exciting to be pulling all these pieces together and be continuing on with this. And I'll be talking a little bit more about this at our yearly state heat meeting next month. So with that, I think we have our thank you slide, and we're excited to answer some questions.